рукою!
Meeting that President Yanukovych knows what he needs to do. The whole world is watching. We want to see a better future for Ukraine. I made it absolutely clear to him that what happened last night, what has been happening in security terms here, is absolutely impermissible in a European state, in a democratic state. The United States stands with you in your search for justice, for human dignity, for security.
Pretty tense with protesters barricading themselves in central city, unwilling to go anywhere, and recent statements by the Prime Minister are adding more fuel to the fire. He said, I quote, that the fact that the protesters overtook some governmental buildings is a clear sign of an attempted coup d'etat in the country. On the other hand, he also said that the government was ready to sit at the same table with the opposition to negotiate a plan how to work this political crisis out, and he also promised that peaceful protesters will not be touched by the special forces, by the police.
We've obviously seen reports of a truce between the government and the opposition. Truce is implemented, it could provide space for the sides to resolve their disagreements peacefully. With regard to Ukraine, along with our European partners, we will continue to engage all sides, and we continue to stress to President Yanukovych and the Ukrainian government that they have the primary responsibility to prevent the kind of terrible violence that we've seen, to withdraw riot police, to work with the opposition to restore security and human dignity.
And ultimately, it is the regime that is responsible for resolving the current situation. It is the regime that created this situation, not by taking decisions that were merely unpopular, but by undertaking decisions that went against the very nature and aspirations of Ukraine as an independent state. And for that reason, we hold the government responsible and urge them to take all the steps necessary to resolve the situation and to put Ukraine back on the democratic and Euro-Atlantic path that the Ukrainian people desire.
So it's time to set the record straight. The Russian government would have you believe it was the opposition
who failed to implement the February 21st agreement that called for a peaceful transition. Ignoring the reality that it was Yanukovych who, when history came calling, when his country was in need, when this city was the place where the action was, where the leaders of the nation were gathered in order to decide the future, he broke his obligation to sign that agreement, and he fled into the night with his possessions, destroying papers behind him.
I would like to remind you that I am not only the legitimate president of Ukraine, but I'm also the chief of staff, the commander of the army. I am alive, and I have not been impeached according to the Ukrainian constitution. The United States and a number of other countries have been stressing that I have allegedly lost my legitimacy because I fled the country. Let me say again, I never fled anywhere. While the radicals were attacking and seizing constitutional and public and government buildings, as you all know very well, I was in Ukraine, in Kharkiv in particular, and later I went to Donetsk and to the Crimea. During the coup, I never left the territory of Ukraine. These days there have been quite a few attempted terrorist actions against me, but they failed.
Extraordinary awe, the power of individuals unarmed except with ideas, people with beliefs and principles and values who have reached for freedom, for equality, for opportunity. There's nothing more important in this world. That is what drives change in so many parts of the world today. It's really partly why the world is in such a state of transformation in so many different places at the same time. These brave Ukrainians took to the streets in order to stand peacefully against tyranny and to demand democracy. So instead, they were met with snipers who picked them off one after the other. The Russian government would have you believe that the Ukraine government somehow is illegitimate or led by extremists, ignoring the reality.
Disguised behind a veneer of an allegedly legitimate government, there is a gang of ultra-nationalists and fascists now acting in Ukraine, involving people who are now aspiring to a presidential office. These people are firing security officials, both in the center, in Kiev, but also in Ukrainian regions. The cities are being patrolled by masked gunmen, and there is an increasing flow of lawlessness against Ukrainians. This new government is firing officers from the army, those officers who do not want this lawlessness to be committed against civilians. Just think of it, they want the army to act as Bandera gangs, and they want a civil war to break out. They want to engage militants from nationalist organizations and to arm them. I would like to ask their patrons in the West, those who patronize these dark forces, are you blinded by what is happening? Have you lost your memory? Have you forgotten what fascism is?
I don't think there's a competition between the United States and Russia. I think this is an expression of the hopes and aspirations of people inside of Syria and people inside of the Ukraine.
We must also expand and sharpen our international broadcasting to Russia and to Ukraine and others in the region in order to counter the propaganda that Moscow is peddling to spread instability and fear that it can then exploit. One of the most important things that can happen here is if we get back up on our feet with the type of effective broadcasting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty used to do into that part of the world. So this committee just passed and the President signed legislation to improve broadcasting into Ukraine. We are in an information war, and we are looking to see what else is needed in this effort to have surrogate radio bring real news in real time in terms of what is actually happening in the eastern part of the country and in Russia into that region.
And one of the biggest concerns that we've seen is the Russian propaganda that has been blasted out nonstop, suggesting somehow that the Ukrainian government is responsible for the problems in eastern Ukraine.
That is absurd, and there is no other word to describe it.
Mr. Lavrov's ludicrous claims from yesterday.
But one of the difficulties we face is this massive Russian propaganda campaign, but also that there are no journalistic standards, including a standard of truth in what's being pumped out.
Propaganda bullhorn that is the state-sponsored Russia Today program has been deployed to promote, actually Russia Today Network has deployed to promote President Putin's fantasy about what is playing out on the ground. They almost spend full time devoted to this effort to propagandize and to distort what is happening or not happening in Ukraine.
Would that Russia allowed it, would that the separatists allowed it, this would be the freest media environment Ukraine has ever enjoyed for an election. But as you know, it is precisely that free media environment that is threatening to this illegally armed movement. There is a sound framework for free media.
The head of Ukraine's state TV company has been attacked and forced to resign by at least 3 MPs from the far-right Svoboda party. They barged their way into the offices of Alexander Pantelemonov, accusing him of serving Putin and being Moscow trash. They were angry that the company had broadcast the Russian parliament signing a treaty with Crimea. Ironically, the man with the ponytail is the deputy head of Ukraine's Committee on Freedom of Speech.
Propaganda megaphone is the only thing that can be heard. So we are very grateful to this committee. We're very grateful to the Congress for the support that you're showing for the programming we are helping the Ukrainians support. We recently increased by $1.5 million our support to Ukrainian government efforts to help prepare for the election and get truth out across. We have recently increased the support we give to the Ukrainian government for its own media center. We have a very sizable public diplomacy program in Ukraine. We get us back to the kinds of tools that we used to have for this kind of an effort. Put out a regular product twice a week to all of our embassies, to all of our contacts in the media around the world, and particularly in Europe, counteracting falsehoods and putting out truths. Very intensive effort with our allies and partners to support those voices trying to correct Russia's false narratives. I think you've probably seen our United for Ukraine campaign, which is now only 5% government content. The other 95% is taken up by global supporters of Ukraine. So these efforts are very important, but we're going to have to do more if we are now back to the future and in a propaganda environment where truth is not an obstacle. Mounted in the last couple of months under Secretary for Public Diplomacy Rick Stengel's authority and all of government effort to counteract Putin's lies. It includes our United for Ukraine Twitter campaign, which now has totally outstripped government. Only 5% of the content is government. It's 95% now a public conversation.
In numerous tweets today, that I think this is a new development, the Russian Foreign Ministry seems to have stolen your hashtag United for Ukraine meme. Do you have any reaction to this? Why they're putting out their stuff with United for Ukraine on it. They seem to have hijacked or be trying to hijack it. Would you suggest that they get their own, or are you okay with this?
I don't think they're living by their
And one of the things that the Ukrainians are very focused on now is a get out the vote campaign across the country.
It's still not completely clear who incited the violent attacks on City Hall and the President's office. Some accuse ultra-right-wing supporters, others say it was provocateurs. Whoever it was, the group was prepared and very well organized.
As we can see on the pictures, the attack on the municipal authorities building in Kiev has been inspired and conveyed by ultra-nationalist forces. What's quite interesting, those parties get some support and funding from NGOs, which are run by American foundations, quite active on the Ukrainian political scene.
Adding fuel to the debate around who masterminded the clashes is the continuous appearance of European politicians at Kiev's protests.
What do you think?
I think we're in play.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
I'll go for 2 minutes to Mr. Rohrbacher, chair of the Europe and Eurasia Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just happen to be chairman of this subcommittee at this particular moment in history. How interesting. I think that we should all understand that the situation in Ukraine is much murkier than what is being presented by the rhetoric that we hear every day. This is not simply a case of Russian aggression. When that president, Yanukovych, was forced out of office by street violence, that's when this chaos started. So let's not say, oh my goodness, the Russians are responsible for all this problem that's going on. The fact is, it started before there was any Russian intervention at all, when an elected president was thrown out, and my gosh, the United States didn't seem to be concerned that this elected person in a free election was being kicked out by, which basically was based on street violence that created a chaotic situation in which, of course, we ended up with what? Yanukovych, of course, was someone who was elected the last time. Very well-observed election, I might add. Matter of fact, Chris Smith was there observing that election, gave that election a very big plus. Yanukovych was elected, so he does represent a significant point of view in that country.
In 2010, Yanukovych won against Tymoshenko, and of course, Yushchenko came in a very distant third, but it did trigger a runoff, and, you know, we didn't get the winner, and it was Yanukovych. And it was judged to be a free and you know, a true election with some discrepancy, but largely free and fair.
This all began. When did this crisis begin? When did the chaos that we see begin? We began when an elected president of Ukraine, who was probably elected in the fairest and and most honest election Ukraine has ever had. When was that street violence? When did it start? It started when the elected president decided, as he rightfully was elected to do, to make an economic agreement with Russia rather than the EU. Now, this is much, much murkier than what's being presented. One thing is for sure, we should not be jumping into it.
Opposition members of parliament in Ukraine are up in arms over the suspension of negotiations on a trade pact with the European Union, just a week before it was due to be signed. An order issued by the Prime Minister stated that talks on the long-planned association agreement were to be halted for now, adding that Kiev would focus on strengthening economic ties with Moscow.
For that reason, we hold the government responsible and urge them to take all the steps necessary to resolve the situation and to put Ukraine back on the democratic and Euro-Atlantic path that the Ukrainian people.
And it is about all those who value democracy.
We didn't get a reassuring message from our European partners. We weren't convinced that the losses in our commercial relations with Russia, which we've been suffering over the last 4 months, would be balanced by the future sales of our products on European markets.
What are our policies? When are we in favor of territorial integrity? When are we in favor of self-determination? When are we cheering on the people of South Sudan or Croatia? When are we opposed it? Why do we oppose the independence of northern Kosovo?
About that street violence that happened that led to this Mr. Yanukovych's removal, there were pictures that people running around with these that we were told were neo-Nazis. Were there neo-Nazis in those street violence that led to Mr. Yanukovych's removal?
First of all, the vast majority of those who participated on the Maidan were peaceful protesters. If you had a chance to see the pictures, many of us visited, including many members here. There were mothers and grandmothers and veterans.
Let me note that I have.
However,
before you go on, I saw those pictures as well. I also saw a lot of pictures of people throwing firebombs at groups of policemen who were huddled over in a corner, where people shooting into the ranks of police. So yes, there were mothers with flowers, but there were also very dangerous street fighters who were engaged in those demonstrations. The question is, were there neo-Nazi groups involved in that?
There were, as I said, almost every color of Ukraine was represented, including some ugly colors.
The answer is yes, then.
These brave Ukrainians took to the streets in order to stand peacefully against tyranny and to demand democracy.
But if I could say that with regard to the violence, all of those incidents are subject to investigation, notably including the deadly sniper incident in February, and there is good evidence to believe that there were outside agitators involved in it.
So instead, they were met with snipers who picked them off one after the other.
It's quite disturbing. The same Olga told that, well, all the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well, yeah.
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that as medical doctor, she can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition, that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened, so that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
I think they do want to investigate. I mean, I didn't pick that up. It's interesting. Gosh.
Yeah, so that it was, in this sense, disturbing that if it starts now to live its own life very powerfully, that it already discreditates from very beginning also this new coalition.
Indication that there were guns being involved with the anti-government demonstrators at that time?
There is no question that as the protests became more and more virulent, and as the response of Yanukovych's police became more and more brutal, the tensions and the potential for use of weapons escalated on both sides.
Unarmed, except with ideas.
Suggestions or implications that somehow Americans are responsible for meddling inside Ukraine. I have to say that our only interest is for Ukraine to be able to make its own decisions. And the last thing we want is disorder and chaos in the center of Europe. So, you know, for the German audience who perhaps is tuning into Russian TV, I would just advise to stay focused on the facts and what's happened on the ground.
Я сама готова сейчас брать автомат, понимаешь, и идти стрелять этому в лоб.
Так я вчера сказал, что если, не дай бог, возникнет военный конфликт, я выступал на свободе слова. Я говорю, если, не дай бог, возникнет военный конфликт, я офицер запаса, и мой старший сын офицер запаса. Мы возьмем оружие и пойдем защищать страну.
Послушай, она тоже переходит все границы вообще. Блин, надо брать оружие в руки и идти мочить этих, блин, кацапов чертовых вместе с их руководителем.
Я скажу тебе, а что теперь делать оставшимся 8 миллионам русских, которые остались на территории Украины? Они же изгои.
Блин, их расстреливать из атомного оружия.
Impressions?
Impressions are sad. So that, well, my impression is in this sense sad that there is, well, no trust towards also these politicians who will return now to the coalition. Well, people from Maidan and from civil society, they say that they know everybody who will be in new government. All these guys have dirty past.
Ми згадуємо те, як люди боролися проти агресорів, які намагалися захопити землю. І ці агресори мотивували своє захоплення не тільки бажанням, і не стільки бажанням захопити чужі території і поработити людей. Вони також висували гасла про начебто звільнення націй і народів, які проживають на землях, які збирався захопити Гітлер. Якщо ви читаєте історію, зараз дуже багато телепередач про це, ми бачимо, що він передусім висував гасла звільнення людей від комуністичного іга, звільнення людей від тирана Сталіна, звільнення від інших речей. Шановні друзі, і це було першим мотивом для Гітлера рух на суверенну державу. Люди можуть і будуть відвоювати. Проживають на території країни, вони мали можливість проживати в спокійній країні, друзі, в спокійній країні, не піддаючись ні ніякій провокації. Сьогодні ми вшановуємо всіх людей, які загинули під час Шановуємо всіх, хто загинув безвинно, бояв за звільнення нашої батьківщини, за звільнення земель, які були загарбані.
The Russian government would also have you believe that the calm and friendly streets, one of which I walked down, but many of which I just drove through, that somehow these streets of Kiev are actually dangerous. Ignoring the reality that there has been no surge in crime, no surge in looting, no political retribution.
There is enormous pressure against the members of parliament that there are uninvited visitors during the night to party members. Well, some journalists who were with me, they saw during the day that one member of parliament was just beat in front of the parliament building by these guys with the guns on the streets.
Not a single piece of credible evidence supports any one of these claims.
Меня ударили. Да ладно, ладно.
Вот мы сейчас возвращались оттуда, посмотрите на лицо моего.
Меня било человек 5-6 дубинками. Я реально стоял без ничего. Реально меня...
Просто за то, что...
Я возмутился, что моей жене в лицо краской брызнули. У нее нет ни дубинок, ничего. Она просто снимала. Вот фотоаппарат, остатки краски. Мы просто пришли посмотреть, что происходит в Киеве. Мы не согласны там с теми, может не согласны где-то с вами, но бить вот так просто людей, это капец. И никто ничего не заступает, ничего, просто окружает толпа пацанов, человек 10 с дубинками и хуярит ногами, руками, по лицу, и все. И это безнаказанно, понимаете? Я отходил со своей женой, я защищал ее. На нас накинулось человек 10, оторвали до дома, возле Билы.
Here in the streets today, I didn't see anybody who feels threatened.
Викликав до суперативу.
Я благодарен тем ребятам, которые спасли. Я благодарен Игорю, который дал мне свою одежду.
время утверждал, что у нас националисты проамериканскую и прозападную политику проводят и отстаивают их интересы. Но я ошибся, потому что, судя по тому, кто у нас начинал захватывать здания, администрации и когда, вы не забыли, господа националисты, кто захватывал СБУ, милицию, кто захватывал арсеналы, кто захватил оружие, и до сих пор тысячи стволов находятся в руках тех, кто уже сформировали бандформирование и шастают по всей Украине. Разве не вы дали пример и сценарий? Так оказывается, вы выполняли не американский, а сценарий Российской Федерации по уничтожению независимости Украины, по расколу Украины, по разграблению Украины. Вы эти примеры все показали сегодня, граждане объективно правильно используют, потому что вы все время говорили о том, что вам угрожают силовиками. Вы сегодня вооруженных людей бросили против тех, кто мирным путем хотели отстоять свои права. Вы сегодня все делаете для того, чтобы запугать людей. Вы арестовываете людей. Вы ведете и развязали борьбу против инакомыслия. Я считаю...
As international observers on the ground have borne witness, prior to Russia's escalation, there was no violence. There was no broad-scale assault on the rights of people.
You were an eyewitness, to a certain extent a participant of the drama. Can you tell us what you saw happening on that day?
A couple of days ahead of the tragic day, we learned about a planned march by the so-called ultras, or football fans, in Odessa. The route of their march lay through a major square where our camp was set up. These seemingly peaceful fans gathered on Soborная Square in downtown Odessa, but then they took out shields, helmets and arms. Back at the square where we were stationed, we had the Odessa militia and the People's Militia units. The Odessa militia moved to Alexandrovsky Avenue to block their march through our camp. Well, we were all aware of the outcome of possible clashes. After Kharkov and other cities, the ratio of forces was 10-1. When violence broke out, we rushed to that place because it was a matter of life and death. We kept up our defenses for around 2 hours. The attackers carjacked a fire truck, broke through the police lines and pushed us back. They forced us to split into smaller groups of 10-15 people. Our group was one of the first to get back to the camp. You see, no one really expected such cruelty and hatred, so we got inside the trades union's building and closed all the doors. We thought they would set the tents on fire and leave. Obviously, it wasn't enough for them. They started hurling Molotov cocktails. The outraged crowd outside was shouting that they wouldn't let anybody out alive. The police were idle, not doing anything. We saw policemen with red armbands. We still don't know what kind of units they were from, so it could have been a third force.
Tatiana, There were many photos published from inside the building. Some of them showed dead people with bullet wounds.
That's right.
Why is that? Did you see anyone shooting at you?
The shooting started at Greciska Street. There were lots of people with gunshot wounds. Half an hour into the fighting, we lost 3 activists and 1 policeman. All were killed. They were obviously armed, as bullets were just flying over our heads like a nightmare. A pregnant woman was burned alive. Many people were strangled. I don't know how they managed to get through the fire, but they did.
So activists did get inside the building?
Yes.
I mean the pro-government activists.
Yes, the pro-government activists were able to get inside. They finished off some of the people who managed to escape. Others were thrown out of the windows, including women, the elderly, and men. They wouldn't let the ambulances to get anywhere near. As I said, I was the last one to get out. I was wearing a St. George ribbon on my arm. The emergency doctors were trying to get me out, but they ended up being severely beaten. The attackers blocked me with their bats behind the backs of the policemen. When I asked the policemen to help, they didn't even respond. Coming inside the building. For 2 days, access to it was blocked. It was cordoned off by dense police unit. For 24 hours, 32 burned, unidentified corpses were lying on the street. As we know, the so-called governor of the Odessa region, Mr. Nemirovsky, is planning a parade on May the 9th. So on the morning of May 3rd, the square was cleared up, but there was no investigation underway.
Many others, not just the United States, speak to their beliefs about the strong connection between Russia and the armed militants, and we certainly stand by that.
Plain sight. Russia continues to fund, coordinate, and fuel a heavily armed separatist movement in Donetsk.
The role that Russian special services have played in destabilizing eastern Ukraine is indisputable in supporting so-called separatist coordinated armed attacks on government buildings and in orchestrating kidnappings and violence against local politicians, reporters, and even OSCE monitors.
But in the 21st century, where every citizen can broadcast messages, images, and video from the palm of their hand, no amount of propaganda is capable of hiding such actions. No amount of propaganda will hide the truth, and the truth is there in the social media and across the pages of newspapers and in the video of televisions for all of the world to see. No amount of propaganda can withstand that kind of scrutiny today. Even as we were preparing to meet in Geneva, we know that the Russian intelligence services were involved in organizing local pro-Russian militias. Some of the individual special operations personnel who were active on Russia's behalf in Chechnya, Georgia, and Crimea have been photographed in Sloviansk, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Some are even bragging about it by themselves on their Russian social media sites.
You keep calling it evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this is evidence that would stand up in a court of law?
I don't think it's a legal, we're not making a court of law case here. We're just showing that this is photographic evidence that indicates the connection we've been talking about for weeks now.
You're saying that these photographs back up classified intelligence that you've
No, I'm not
gotten
saying
from
that
the-
at all. I'm saying they back up the public argument we've been making for weeks. What we see in the photos that have been, again, in international media, on Twitter, and publicly available, is that there are individuals who visibly appear to be tied to Russia.
Right.
We've said that publicly a countless number of times. I will let you all draw the conclusion. The range of the photos that the Ukrainians have provided, and to be fair, a number of U.S. officials have tweeted and provided publicly, are from publicly available photos, either in international media or already on Twitter, that show either individuals or signs of a connection with between Russia and some of the armed militants in eastern Ukraine. So that, as you know, has long been what we have believed, and we've made the case publicly about, whether that's the Secretary or the President or others. So these are just further evidence of the connection between Russia and the armed
I guess I'm just not sure why you keep pointing out that they're publicly available. I mean, no one's saying they're not, but but you know, just because they're publicly available doesn't. I don't see how that buttresses your argument one way or the other. What
That the United States government, with its great tradition of intelligence gathering and sources and so on, is now dependent on publicly traded photographs on the internet and Twitter and so on.
Secretary Kerry has stated, we continue to have high confidence that Russia's hand is behind this.
Just if you look at these photos.
I'm just, as you know, and you've talked about, and the Russians have talked about as well, there's this propaganda war that's going on between the two sides. And what we saw last week was Secretary Kerry in Geneva getting up and talking about this leaflet that was put out, which regarding Jewish registration in Donetsk. And it appears that this is just a hoax. This is not a real thing, and yet it was identified as something of major significance by the Secretary and by
there's
others.
a range of details out there we've talked about that leads us to believe there's a strong connection. We'll let people draw their own conclusions.
Jen?
I guess a different interpretation of the photos than...
Well, there were a range of photos, and not just a range of photos. The Ukrainians presented a range of photos in Vienna just a few weeks ago. There have been a range of photos available in international media, available on Twitter and social media sites that have portrayed a range of events. I think you're talking about one photo. We still feel confident that there is a strong connection between Russia and the armed militants in eastern Ukraine.
Подстрелили пацаны, блядь. Ой, блядь, ты ебанулся. Ебать, блядь, ты скорую! Скорую! Ёб твою мать, блядь, мужика.
Перекрыть трубу, и пусть Аль поедет, развлекается, всех отстреливает там, и в мешках, и в центральную тюрьму. Потому что эти люди не заслуживают, они на чужой территории находятся, на нашей украинской территории. Крым это, Харьков, Днепропетровск, Донецк, это все наша территория. И если там находится российский гражданин с георгиевской ленточкой и орет, срывает наш флаг, ему надо стрелять в голову, потому что это враг. И не надо с ним разговаривать, не надо его воспитывать.
Я бы действовала намного жестче. Я бы их просто стреляла, простите. Послушайте, враг господствует на нашей земле. О чем мы говорим? Его нужно было гнать отсюда еще с 1654 года. Поэтому сегодняшняя реакция абсолютно адекватна. Но меры должны быть намного жестче. Наши люди положили свои жизни. Поэтому эти существа, которые ездят сюда, заслуживают только одного – смерти.
Stamattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato,
Что ты делаешь?
Andai via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, andiamo, portami via. Аккуратно! Тихо, аккуратно!
Bir sabah uyandığımda ciao bella ciao bella ciao bella ciao ciao
to help protect ethnic Russians, as it purports to. And if they were threatened, we would support efforts to protect them, as would, I am told, the government of Ukraine.
End to violence, intimidation, and the seizure of buildings and call for the illegally armed groups to stand down.
Clear that President Putin is responsible for this crisis. He has trampled on Ukraine's sovereignty. He has illegally seized Crimea, the first annexation in Europe since the end of World War II. He has tried to instigate separatism and destabilize the country, and he has massed his troops on Ukraine's border, promoted discord and conflict, and set individuals, families, and peoples against one another.
Mr. Putin say, well, Kiev has to do a better job of reaching out to Eastern Europe or Eastern Ukraine. You've seen attempts by Kiev in a very serious way to propose decentralization of power.
These sanctions, I would think that in order for them to really be effective, the people of Russia have to.
We condemned the outbreak of violence caused by pro-Russia separatists this morning in Mariupol, which has resulted in multiple deaths. We continue to call for groups who have jeopardized public order by taking up arms and seizing public buildings in violation of Ukrainian law to disarm and leave the buildings.
Я ошибся, потому что, судя по тому, кто у нас начинал захватывать здания администрации, и когда, вы не забыли, господа националисты, кто захватывал СБУ, милицию, кто захватывал арсеналы, кто захватил оружие, и до сих пор тысячи стволов находятся в руках. Разве не вы дали пример и сценарий? Так как...
Еще одного ранили, блядь! Пидорасы! Расстреливать людей мирных.
The government in Kiev has followed through on the commitments that it made in Geneva.
From day one, the government of Ukraine started making good on its commitments.
The Ukrainian government began implementing its part of the Geneva Agreement even before the ink was dry on the text. The day after, the Ukrainian government sent a draft amnesty bill to the Rada on April 14th, 29th, and just yesterday, the Constitutional Reform Commission has held broad public conferences with all the regions, and Ukrainian security forces instituted an Easter pause in their operations and sent senior officials out with the OSCE teams to Donetsk and Slavyansk and Luhansk and other embattled cities to try to talk separatists into pursuing their aims politically rather than through violence.
From day one, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has kept his word. He immediately agreed to help vacate buildings. He suspended Ukraine's counterterrorism initiative over Easter, choosing de-escalation despite Ukraine's legitimate fundamental right to defend its own territory and its own people.
You will have seen the trip of Prime Minister Yatsenyuk to the most embattled area of the East, Slavyansk, yesterday on a mission of political reconciliation.
Ciao partigiano, me voy contigo porque nessuno aquí.
Вы без оружия! Ах ты пидор! Ай ты пидор! Рикошетом ранен. Провокатор, иди нахуй отсюда. Ты что, гонишь, ебать? Что, блядь? Ты хочешь спровоцировать, блядь? Смотри, сколько можно... Ты хочешь насилие, блядь? Я хочу, блядь. Бля, красиво очень нихуя.
Там кебаб,
Офіційно заявляємо, що фактично ніякого референдуму там не проводиться. Це не більше, ніж інформаційна кампанія терористів, явка по всій області.
Meanwhile, Russian leaders are making increasingly outrageous claims.
Has the right sector militia been disarmed, and has Kiev tried very hard to disarm them?
The government of Ukraine has made a massive effort to disarm the Pravi sector, to lock up those leaders who have been found to use violence. They are also putting them on trial. They've also offered a weapons buyback program, and they're working very intensively.
How successful has that effort been?
They have made significant progress, and there's more progress to make.
Пенсионеры еще туда пойдут. Ставку провести. Долго нахуй. Долго, да, пушат, да. Завтра тут кипиш будет!
Фотографируйте, блядь, человеку ногу, блядь, перебили нахер. Автоматом, блядь. Не надо
Давай. Ебать, интересно. Где скорая? Вы чё, блядь? На. Шо?
Все, давай.
Живой, что вы, блядь, орете все? Живой, блядь, что вы делаете? Переверните нахуй. Отходите оттуда.
Скорая, сука.
Может, блядь, с крыши стрелял, блядь, по людям. Что ты, готов?
А ну.
Скорая!
Скорая.
Блядь! Ебать! Уже сильно.
And as Ukrainian forces move to restore order in eastern Ukraine, it is obvious to the world that these Russian-backed groups are not peaceful protesters. They are heavily armed militants who are receiving significant support from Russia. The Ukrainian government has the right and responsibility to uphold law and order within its territory, and Russia needs to use its influence over these paramilitary groups so they disarm and stop provoking violence.
We agreed that all sides would refrain from violence, intimidation, and taking provocative actions. The world has rightly judged that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and the government of Ukraine are working in good faith. Russia has talked about Russian-speaking minority citizens who are under siege. They're not. And in fact, this government has acted remarkably responsibly.
The government has shown remarkable restraint throughout this process. The notion that this is some spontaneous uprising in eastern Ukraine is belied by all the evidence of well-organized, trained, armed militias with the capacity to shoot down helicopters. Generally, local protesters don't possess that capacity of surface-to-air missiles or whatever weapons were used to shoot down helicopters, tragically. We've seen...
I am troubled by separatists' insistence that they move ahead with a referendum this weekend.
It is clear that Russian special forces and agents have been the catalyst behind the chaos in the last 24 hours. Some have even been arrested and exposed.
Russian disinformation campaigns have only made matters worse, and I echo the sentiments of the chairman of this committee as this committee has moved forward in a bipartisan effort to increase international broadcasts.
Referendums have zero credibility in the eyes of the world. They are illegal by anybody's standards. They don't meet any standard, not a single standard of objectivity, transparency, fairness, or being properly conducted as a public referendum or election. And indeed, the people organizing them didn't really even pretend to meet any of those standards.
Right now, Ukrainian troops are battling separatists in eastern Ukraine.
Every day since we left Geneva, every day, even up to today, when Russia sent armored battalions right up to the Luhansk Oblast border, the world has witnessed a tale of two countries with vastly different understandings of what it means to uphold an international agreement. And the world, sadly, has rightly judged that Russia has put its faith in distraction, deception, and destabilization.
Creating this crisis, Putin is trying to mask the ills that he faces at home, and who better to play his foil than us here in the United States, with a growing number of Russians dissatisfied with the economy and his policies. The latest news that Putin is now supporting the May 25 election must be taken with a grain of salt, because there's surely ulterior motives at play.
As NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe wrote this week, what is happening in eastern Ukraine is a military operation that is well planned and organized, and we assess that it is being carried out at the direction of Russia.
With regard to Ukraine, along with our European partners, we will continue to engage all sides, and we continue to stress to President Yanukovych and the Ukrainian government that they have the primary responsibility to prevent the kind of terrible violence that we've seen, to withdraw riot police, to work with the opposition to restore security and human dignity,
and ultimately it is the regime that is responsible for resolving the current situation.
Sorry, go ahead. Does the U.S. approve of Kiev sending troops against protesters in the east, and how does it fall under the Geneva Agreement that was designed to help de-escalate the situation? Doesn't it further escalate it?
Sure. Well, let me just outline, and Matt asked a little bit of this too. They have the right to maintain calm, maintain stability, maintain order in their country.
So you prevent, okay, other than putting all responsibility on Russia, which by the way is saying that it doesn't have control over everything that's happening in East Ukraine, what does the U.S. do to de-escalate, to help de-escalate this situation, other than putting all responsibility on Russia?
Well, I don't think it's putting all responsibility on Russia at all.
Was it a coincidence that both times Kiev ordered troops to East Ukraine came right on the heels of top U.S. officials' visit to Kiev? First time it was John Brennan, and this time it was Vice President Joe Biden. Did Vice President Joe Biden advise Kiev to take such action, or was it just a coincidence?
I think you're simply restating Foreign Minister Lavrov's ludicrous claims from yesterday.
But what is the response?
I think we're ready to move on to a new Ukraine question. Go ahead, Elise. Oh, it's something else? Anyone else on Ukraine? Ukraine, go ahead.
Reports that Ukrainian military attacked
I hear calls from people in the southeast to lay down arms. I tell my partners in Kiev, it's a great call, but pull the army away from the civilians first. Are you completely out of your mind? APCs, tanks, artillery, against who are you going to use the artillery and the aircraft?
bit about this Russian colonial federalization?
One of the thorniest issues in foreign policy is self-determination versus territorial integrity. We've supported the independence of South Sudan and accepted the independence of Eritrea. In Europe, we supported the independence of each of the republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We supported the independence of each of the republics of the Federation of Yugoslavia. We created the independence of Kosovo. On the other hand, we oppose the independence of northern Kosovo. We oppose the independence of the Krajine region of Croatia, which was inhabited by Serbs. We oppose the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and we, of course, oppose the independence or any other action with Crimea. Seems kind of haphazard. In Moscow, they note that although I've identified like 30 different decisions we've had to make in Europe that seem haphazard, every single one of those decisions is the anti-Moscow decision.
Чувство младости со своих детей, может, мы добьемся лучшей жизни.
Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Es war so warm hier, an ihrem Arm hier. Da draußen werd ich bald schon frieren. Es war so warm hier, an ihrem Arm hier. Da draußen werd ich bald schon frieren.
那一天早晨。 梦中醒来，啊，朋友再见吧，再见吧，再见吧。一天早晨，从梦中醒来，亲热着闯进我的家。
The world is waking outside my window. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Turns my senses into the sunlight, for there are things that I must do. Wish me luck now, I have to leave you. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. With my friends now, up to the city. We're gonna shake the gates of hell.
Una mattina mi sto svegliato. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sto svegliato e ho trovato l'invaso. Oh partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, perché mi sento di morire. E se io muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Se io muoio da partigiano, e tu mi devi seppellire lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Seppellire lassù in montagna e sotto l'ombra di un bel fiore. E le genti che passeranno, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E le genti che passeranno e mi diranno che bel fiore, e questo è il fiore del partigiano. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E questo è il fiore del partigiano, è morto per la libertà. E questo è il fiore del partigiano, è morto per la libertà.
Киевской хунте нет. Киевской хунте нет. Нет места.
Донецкая Народная Республика, да.
А вы?
Боже, конечно, что мы собрались. Отсоединяться от этого Киев.
И безоружных людей стреляли, которые вышли на мирную демонстрацию.
Ukrainians who want to build a better life and choose their leaders for themselves, by themselves.
Our view from the start has been that the Ukrainians should be able to make their own decisions. Recognize that basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, fair and free elections, the ability to run a business without paying a bribe, to not be discriminated against because of your religion or your beliefs, that those are fundamental rights.
I don't think it's appropriate for the United States or any other country to come here, talk about the strength and courage of the people in the streets, to underscore the value of democracy and of freedom that people are fighting for here, and then just walk away and not do anything about it.
Sure that the people of Ukraine are able to make decisions for themselves about their future, that the people of Syria are able to make decisions without having bombs going off and killing women and children, or chemical weapons, or towns being starved. Mr. Putin has a different view on many of those issues, and I don't think that there's any secret on that. I want to take this opportunity to address the situation in Venezuela and Ukraine, and the unacceptable violence in those two countries, which the United States strongly condemns.
Will Mubarak be seen as a dictator? Look, Mubarak has been an ally of ours in a number of things that he's been very responsible on relative to geopolitical interest in the region, the Middle East peace efforts, the actions Egypt has taken relative to normalizing relationship with Israel. I think that it would be, I would not refer to him as a dictator.
That historic meeting that took place 65 years ago between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and His Majesty's father, King Abdulaziz, we have had a strong and strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
President Obama came out in 2011 and said, wherever people come out to demand freedom and dignity or democracy, they will find a friend in the United States of America. And the people of Bahrain did that. They did take to the streets, and they did demand freedom and democracy. And yet, they did not find a friend in the United States of America.
You know, in many cases, the Human Rights Watch asserts that even children have been subject to torture by the Assad regime.
You see that report as credible and solid, and you're endorsing it? I mean, you're saying
We have no reason to believe that it is not credible. It's based on eyewitness accounts, and they're reporting from a broad cross-section of human rights figures inside Syria.
So the next time Human Rights Watch comes out with a report that's critical of Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians, I'll assume that you're going to be saying the same thing, correct? That you think that the report is credible, it's based on eyewitness accounts, and you're not going to say that it's politically motivated and should be dismissed?
You know, Matt, as you have made clear again and again in this room, we are not always consistent.
So, in other words, anything that Human Rights Watch says that is critical of someone you don't like, that's okay. But once they criticize someone that you do like, then it's not worth the paper. Staying silent while people are dying left and right.
In Venezuela, rather than trying to distract from its own failings by making up false accusations against diplomats from the United States, the government ought to focus on addressing the legitimate grievances of the Venezuelan people. So, along with the Organization of American States, we call on the Venezuelan government to release protesters that it's detained and engage in real dialogue. And all parties have an obligation to work together to restrain violence.
Outside my window, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 directs my senses into the sunlight. For there are things that I must do. Wish me luck now, I have to leave you. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. With my friends now, up to the city. We're gonna shake the gates of hell. And I will tell them, we will tell them. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. That our sunlight is not for franchise. I wish the bastards dropped down dead. Next time you see me,
We had to take measures to prevent the situation from developing the way it is now in eastern Ukraine, with tanks and well-armed radical nationalists. Of course, behind the self-defense units of Crimeans, we had our servicemen.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
The Party of Regions, is fielding 4 of the 23 candidates who are registered. Communists are also there. Every single color of the political spectrum in Ukraine and every region is represented among the 23 candidates. So there's somebody for everybody to vote for.
So it's better, it's more than just the best observed election, it's a legitimate election.
That is what the OSCE assesses.
Right. Well, we did have an election, we did have a legitimate election before, and the elected president was removed after we had major street violence in reaction to his decision of going with an economic agreement with Russia rather than the EU.
Disguised behind the veneer of an allegedly legitimate government, there is a gang of ultra-nationalists and fascists now acting in Ukraine, involving people who are now aspiring to a presidential office. These people are firing security officials, both in the center, in Kiev, but also in Ukrainian regions. The cities are being patrolled by masked gunmen, and there is an increasing flow of lawlessness against Ukrainians. This new government is firing officers from the army, those officers who do not want this lawlessness to be committed against civilians. Just think of it, they want the army to act as Bandera gangs, and they want a civil war to break out. They want to engage militants from nationalist organizations and to arm them. I would like to ask the patrons in the West, those who patronize these dark forces, are you blinded by what is happening? Have you lost your memory? Have you forgotten what fascism is?
Up to the city, we're gonna shake the gates of hell. And I will tell them, we will tell them, Bella Ciao,